procedure, we are continuing our discussion about trial and what happens at trial. In our last episode about civil procedure, we talked about jury selection, and now we're going to go over the timeline of trial, talk about judgment as a matter of law, and judgment notwithstanding the verdict, and then we're going to talk about denying judgments as a matter of law. And that'll be all that we talk about in this episode. So, what is the trial timeline? How does it work? You've made it past pleadings, you've made it past discovery, you've survived summary judgment. What happens when you actually get to the courtroom after the jury's been selected? Well, you start with presenting your opening statements. And then the plaintiff, after that, is going to present evidence. And so this is going to be a list of 12 things. Opening statements is 1, plaintiff presenting evidence is 2. And what the plaintiff is going to do on this is there's going to be a direct examination. That means that the plaintiff is going to question their witnesses without any leading questions. You can't say, were you in your home sleeping at this time of that day? Instead, you're going to have to say, what were you doing at this time on that day? So no leading questions for the plaintiff against their plaintiffs. And then the cross-examination, that's going to be the defendant asking the plaintiffs what questions, witness questions, trying to get them to change their mind. And the defendant in this instance can ask leading questions. And then after the defendant goes up and questions, well, then the plaintiff goes up and redirects examination, so that they're just trying to come back, rebuild their credibility after the defendants attempted to shut them down. So that's number 2. The third thing at this point is after the plaintiff presents, this is called their case in chief. I believe that's what it's called. The defendant may move under Rule 50A for a judgment as a matter of law. And then after that, if it's denied, then the defendant is going to present evidence. They do their direct examination, the plaintiff goes and does their cross-examination, and then the defendant goes again and does their redirect examination. So, at this point, we've had opening statements, the plaintiff, Rule 50A motion, defendant presents, and now, at this point, in step number 5, both the defendant and the plaintiff may make another motion for Rule 50A. And again, for a judgment as a matter of law. And we'll talk about that and the standard in just a minute. But after that, then there's going to be closing statements if it's denied. That's number 6. Step 7 is jury instructions are going to be given. Step 8, jury is going to deliberate. Step 9, a verdict is going to be awarded by the jury. And then after that, step 10, both the defendant and the plaintiff may move under Rule 50B for a renewed motion if they have already made a Rule 50A motion, and that Rule 50B is going to be judgment notwithstanding the verdict, or JNOV. After that, if it's denied, there's going to be a judgment given, or it could be granted, and then there's going to be an appeal. Instead of a judgment, the court could also grant a new trial. And if a new trial is granted, then there is going to be no appeal yet, because an appeal can only be made upon a judgment. So what is JMOL or JNOV? That's going to be judgment as a matter of law and judgment notwithstanding the verdict. JMOL is Rule 50A and JNOV is Rule 50B. Rule 50 has 2 purposes. The whole purpose of it, and then I'll get into what it is to allow the plaintiff a chance to go ahead and correct the record if they left anything out in their case. And the second purpose is to provide judgment when the plaintiff does not have the evidence necessary to prove their case. So, they've survived summary judgment, you make it a trial, you're presenting, and you don't have the evidence there. That's when a judgment as a matter of law is appropriate. So what is the difference between a summary judgment and JMOL? Well, all it is just timing and procedure. They have the exact same standard. JMOL is required when a reasonable jury would not have a legally sufficient evidentiary basis to find on behalf of one party or the other. In other words, there's no genuine issue to a material fact. And so how can a case survive summary judgment and then later at trial end up having being heard? Ultimately, it's going to come down to people are scared of the court. They may have lied at trial, and now they're at court. They may have lied during discovery, and now that they are at trial, they're like, I don't really remember it that way, or that's not true. That didn't happen in that way. And so ultimately, a witness can change their mind, or what could happen is the plaintiff makes a mistake, or the defendant makes a mistake in presenting their case. They should have asked a question. They didn't ask a question, and so a motion is made, and that's where the other purpose comes in, is to fix what was actually made, because everything that is discovered isn't automatically admitted. To admit it, it has to be tied to a witness. And so if you don't ask a witness something, then it's not considered part of the evidence that is presented. So trying to fix things, but it's following the same standard, and that's why people might ultimately survive summary judgment, but not judgment as a matter of law. So let's go ahead and go more in depth in Rule 50A and Rule 50B. Rule 50A is the direct verdict. It's not named that anymore in federal court. In federal court, it's named judgment as a matter of law, but it ultimately just means the same thing, even though there are different terms. And we've gone over some of these things in the procedure part that we just listed out, but the party, a party must be fully heard before a JMOL motion is made against them. So they need to present all their evidence. They need to present the liability, and then a JMOL could be made, or they could present liability and damages, and then a JMOL can be made. But ultimately, they just need to be fully heard on an issue. So, for example, the plaintiff needs to prove both the law and the damages. A JMOL may be made for either the law or the damages, and it could be made for any claims, but not all the claims. So the party that wants to bring the JMOL then is required to be specific about what claims and what part, whether it's claims, all the claims, damages, all the claims and damages, all the parts that JMOL is targeting. And that's going to be important because when we come to Rule 50B, this is judgment notwithstanding the verdict. Note, this is again after the jury deliberates. This is a renewed motion for judgment. And what that means is that we've made Rule 50A, and because this is a renewal of Rule 50A, it looks very similar to what was made in Rule 50A. If you don't make a motion for Rule 50A, you can't bring that later in Rule 50B. And the whole point of that is because you have to give the other party notice. You can't just bring it on them, especially after the jury deliberates. And so you have to let them know before the jury deliberates. And if you don't, well, then you can't do it later. And that's the whole point of Rule 50B being a renewed motion. Most of the time, though, the judge isn't going to grant a Rule 50A, and this is because the judge wants to make sure that the jury gets it right. The judge could completely agree with the plaintiff about the Rule 50A, that judgment is necessary, but they want to see if the jury gets it right. And the reason for this is because it's going to, in the long run, save time and expenses. If the jury goes and gets it right, then the judge doesn't have to do anything. If the jury goes and gets it wrong in the mind of the judge, well, then the judge is going to give the Rule 50B, because Rule 50A will have been made earlier, and then it's likely going to be appealed because a verdict was made and the judge said no, this isn't right, so it's going to be appealed, and then it goes to the appellate court, And if the appellate court agrees that a judgment notwithstanding the verdict is appropriate, well, then that's final. But if the appellate court disagrees and reverses, they're going to vacate that Rule 50B grant, and then they're just going to simply enact the verdict that was given at trial. So instead of going back and messing it up at Rule 50A, if that goes and gets reversed, well, then you don't have a jury verdict to rely on, and you'd have to do the whole railroad all over again. Not the whole railroad. Sorry, I was looking at my next case. You'd have to do the whole trial all over again. So we have two cases here. One where judgment as a matter of law is merited, and then another where we're going to deny judgment as a matter of law. We actually have three cases talking about when it's merited and where it's not. Our first case, Pennsylvania Railroad Co. versus Chamberlain, it was merited. The key question in this case was there a collision? And if the collision occurred, well then the railroad would be liable. If the collision did not occur, well then Chamberlain died by accident and can't recover from the railroad. Now they have one witness here who did not actually see the collision, but he ended up looking up at it, and it appeared as if there was a collision, but he had a really bad angle. So his testimony was there. It would have been enough to make it go to a jury, but it was lacking, especially when you look at the other parties who did say most of the time, who did all say that no collision had occurred, who were eyewitnesses. So it was denied because the evidence there was not sufficient. It did not counter the others because he actually did not see the collision occur. So judgment as a matter of law was merited against Chamberlain. Now, Lane versus Hardy's Food Systems, judgment as a matter of law was unmerited. The key facts at issue here was when the plaintiff arrived at the store and went to the bathroom. He arrived between 10:26 and 10:45. When the defendant mops the floor, this was a slip and fall case, and that's about 10:30 each day. And then whether or not there was a warning sign placed. Well, the plaintiff in this case went to the bathroom, slipped, fell, sued. And ultimately, our takeaways from here is that circumstantial evidence still makes it possible for the defendant. Circumstantial evidence still makes it possible to prove that the defendant, in this case the Hardys, had spilled the water on the ground. Just because of the timing that they went there and how long it took the person to go to the bathroom. So ultimately it's going to be a jury who determines whether or not it was the defendant or another customer to show whether or not the defendant had left the water there, or if the defendant had left a sign warning that there was water on the ground. So this case, the other takeaway, survives judgment as a matter of law, even if it is not the most reasonable explanation. And that's because the jury could find on behalf of the plaintiff, or it could found in behalf of the defendant, regardless of whichever explanation is more reasonable. Our final case is Reed versus San Pedro. This is a fun case. It's a Utah case. I'm from Utah, so pretty fun. And then it's also a case where so when I was preparing for law school, I was touring the Drake campus, and I sat in on a class, and I didn't realize this at the time. I actually ended up sitting in a class, a civil procedure class. Wasn't paying enough attention to remember that it was civil procedure when I came to school. But we talked about this case, and I just didn't realize it then. Anyways, going back to the case, what ended up happening here is that railroad tracks go through Utah. And there's fences on either side of the railroad tracks because it passes through farmers' lands. Because the railroad had a whole bunch of authority and was able to get all those easements. So the railroad tracks pass through the land. There's fences on both sides. There's gates so that farmers can open the gates and let cattle through. Now, it's the farmer's responsibility to take care of the gates, and it's the railroad tracks' responsibility to take care of the fences. So there were cows that ended up getting onto the railroad track, either through a gate that was left open or through a part of the fence that was broken. And this cow ended up being hit and killed by the train. And so ultimately it's a matter of, is judgment as a matter of law necessary in this case? And here the answer is no. Why? Because the cow ended up dying closer to judgment as a matter of law is granted in this case in favor of the defendant as far as to this particular cow goes. It's because the cow ended up dying close to the gate that was left open instead of the fence that was a mile down way of where the cow was that was broken. So all the evidence, circumstantial evidence, seemed to point towards the cow getting in by the fence. There were footprints there, the gate was open, and the cow was found by the fence by the gate, instead of just a mile down the way where all there was the broken fence. So, using our standard, there's not enough evidence to show that the cow, more likely than not, went through the broken fence. And so JMOL, or JNOV, in favor of the railroad in this case, is appropriate. That was a lot, but we did make it through all this, whether or not we grant judgment. And now, in our next episode, we're going to be talking about granting a new trial. Have a good one. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Law Schoolers. Before I let you go, there are 4 things I want to say. The first thing is if you enjoyed these episodes and if you enjoyed the website, I would invite you to go and join Law Schoolers Pro. And you can do that by going to lawschoolers.com/join. It's a way for you to support us, but there's also a lot of features there that I think you will enjoy. Second thing is that nearly all of our episodes are unedited. The only ones that aren't are pre-law materials, and the reason for that is so you can actually see the legal material in its raw form as I'm learning it as well. The third thing is that the information contained in these episodes are specifically only for educational purposes. They're not to be used as legal advice, and with that, the fourth thing is if it is used as legal advice, we are not liable. That is, Law Schoolers is not liable for any legal outcomes. Thank you again for enjoying the show. Have a good one.